Okay, hello. Welcome back. Thanks so much for everyone who was here last week. My name is Eli Travers, and I work here with Avennia Winery. And we just started doing this new online discussion, is what we'll call it, called All Things Avennia. It's really an opportunity for me as a somm, as a wine educator, to get to dive deep into different subjects, talk about different aspects of the wine industry, um, nerd out a little bit on some of the science behind certain parts of the wine industry, and really just get to know you guys a little bit more and interact a little bit more with our customers and with just the general population. So before we get into this week's topic, just a little bit of housekeeping. As far as last week's discussion about wine barrels, if you haven't had a chance to check out the website, go ahead and go to our website, avennia.com, in the Our News section, which is basically our blog, and go to All Things Avennia, and you'll see a list of last week's topic, but also the next 2 months. So we've gone ahead and scheduled out every single Thursday what we're going to talk about for the next 2 months with a little description, and that way you can sort of take a look ahead. If there's something that really interests you and you want to learn more about, you can put it on your calendar. And then in addition, if you look back at last week's, we've added a link to a PDF, basically of a fact check or some of the unanswered questions. So there were some questions brought up last week that I didn't know the answer to, and I wanted to make sure to follow up, get answers to those, and then get those to you. So that'll be a link there. And then there's also a link to the video recording of last week. So that way, I think it's just a link to a YouTube video, so you can send that to someone else. If someone wanted to be here but wasn't able to, you can forward them the link. So a couple options. We'll all try to do that every single week, so you have both all of your unanswered questions answered and access to video recordings for future use. So I think that was about it. So we're going to get to the main presentation. So at this point, I'm going to share my screen. Awesome. Okay. So I thought it would be fun, since my background is a somm and manager and server and bartender. I've done a lot of different jobs in restaurant world, is sort of just talk about how wine programs are developed, how they're run, and sort of basically the behind the scenes look at wine in restaurants, and then also maybe give some hints and tips about ordering wine, how to talk about wine, and just some ideas about learning more about wine in restaurant scenes. So we'll start with the hard to pronounce but interesting term of sommelier. So I looked up basically the history of a sommelier, which in Old French, the term bête de somme was basically a beast of burden. So this was any animal like an ox or a horse that drew a carriage or did work. And then the sommelier was its herdsman, or the person in charge of that animal. Later, the position sort of developed into an official position with nobility and lords, and they were the ones who basically helped unload all the baggage, all the royal luggage from the carriage and bring it inside. They also were responsible for selecting wines, table settings, desserts for fancy dinners, and then crucially, they would be the ones to taste the wine before the lord or anyone else to make sure it wasn't poisoned, so that if you died, then the lord wouldn't drink the wine and he was safe. Today, sommeliers obviously can do fairly extreme things in the name of hospitality, but they no longer are testing wine for poison. Thank the Lord. So that's good. And then, here we go. Then there's the debate. So the term sommelier, is, at least in the wine industry, has many different definitions. And the basic idea behind it is that some people believe a sommelier is really reserved for people working in a restaurant currently, that are serving wine, selling wine on the floor of a restaurant, and managing wine programs. And there's other people that believe if you get an accreditation or any certificate that says you are a sommelier and that you have that knowledge, that you can take that on and be a sommelier in any part of the industry. In my view, I think a sommelier is someone who works on the restaurant floor, but I also believe that an artist doesn't necessarily need to create art in an art studio to be called an artist. So I don't know where I fall on this debate at the end of it. When we get into the question and answer, if you have a really strong feeling about it, I'd love to hear your thoughts. But a lot of times this whole sommelier term can be a little confusing based on how people are using it. But the main goals of a sommelier or wine director, we can call it that, in a restaurant is really pretty simple. You have to buy wine for the restaurant. You manage the wine program and then sell wine, and that's basically it. Those are the main reasons why you hire people like sommeliers or wine directors with a lot of knowledge for wine and beverages, is to do those three things. But expanding that, let's look at buying wine. So when you think about starting a wine list, starting a restaurant, and offering wine as part of that, it's important to conceptualize what sort of program you want. And a lot of that is based on where you are in the geography. So are you in a city? Are you in a suburb? Are you at a golf course at a country club? Are you, in a really trendy neighborhood of a city? Are you in a more affluent part of a city? So who are your main guests going to be? Is there going to be a lot of tourists? Are you depending on locals and sort of that repeat customer to come in and buy wine? Is it a foodie crowd? Is it a late night post Seahawks game party crowd? Because I've definitely dealt with that before. But no matter what that is, and no matter what your ownership wants this restaurant or the field to be in the restaurant, that's going to affect your wine program. And often overlooked is also, do you know about state and local liquor licenses and liquor rules about selling alcohol? Because that might change the way you do things about whether you can offer cocktails or spirits if you have the right license for it. Sometimes, like here in Seattle, we have we used to have a 2 a.m. cutoff for serving and drinking beverages in public places. So it sort of might limit your late night happy hour times. I think now during COVID, it's 11 p.m. if I'm not mistaken, but something to keep an eye on. And then lastly, what cuisine are you curating a list to pair with? So as a sommelier, really the heart of it is knowing intimately the relationship between food and wine, which is actually a subject we'll get to next week, just as a little plug. But you need to be mindful both what kind of wines serve the food, but also serve the guests. Thinking back to the country club example, you say you were working at a restaurant in a country club and they decide they want to revamp it, maybe do a little renovation, change the kind of restaurant they're doing in the cuisine, and they want to do all Italian food and make it a really cool Italian list. And you go in there and want to just load it up with cool Piedmont wines and Tuscany wines and have this really fancy French Italian wine list. If you don't have a Napa Chardonnay on the list, you're not going to be successful because there's going to be a lot of people asking for Napa Chardonnay. So it's basically the idea that you want to balance the needs of both the cuisine and the people that are there. And then in order to buy wine, you really got to start tasting and actually purchasing. The way to do tastings in most places is actually through distributors. Distributors is part of this 3-tier system, which I guess I'll get into really quickly, which is part of the result of Prohibition. So in the US, Prohibition was repealed in 1933. And because of that, wine laws and alcohol laws all across the country and state to state kind of went their own way and went kind of crazy. But one of the main parts of this was this 3-tier system. And it's the idea that you have your producers, so winery. So here at Avennia, we're part of that first tier. We make the wine, and then we sell the wine to a distributor. Distributor basically being the middleman, so you need to mark up the wine for them to sell directly to the retailer, which is that 3rd tier. Sometimes you have importers. They're sort of part of that 1st tier or 2nd tier, depending on what system you're in. But it basically, for all these reasons, you have different opportunities to buy wine. One of the unique things about us here in Seattle, we actually can sell wine directly to a restaurant, so directly to that retailer without a distributor, at least in King County, in the Seattle area. And there's different states will have different rules about that, different laws. So you can either get wine through distributors, direct from wineries, like I just said, trade tastings or show tastings. A lot of times you'll have grand tastings sponsored by an appellation. Maybe it's like Bordeaux is doing the wines of Bordeaux tasting, and they'll travel around getting people to buy more Bordeaux wines. Or just experience and word of mouth. If you've worked at a previous restaurant and you really like some wines that you want to bring in, you can usually find them. Tasting all the time, every week. It's really important to keep tasting wines so that even if you're settled or you think you're settled on your list, you might come across that perfect Syrah at the right price that is going to be just really great for your program. So constantly tasting. And I think it's important to also use your wine team or your other somms as part of the business to go out and taste as well. At the end of the day, your servers and your somms and bartenders are going to be the ones selling directly to customers, to guests. And the more excited they are about a wine, the better it'll sell. So if they're the ones who get really excited about something they tasted at a trade show, and they really want it in the restaurant, get a case of it, see how it sells, and it's a good way to sort of honor that relationship with your team too. And then the other tough thing actually is purchasing the right amount of wine to get good pricing. So a lot of times you can get these quantity discounts on wines if you buy enough in bulk, which can help your margins, but only really if it can fit in your actual space, in your restaurant and in your storage, which sort of brings me to how to manage an overall wine program. This is the bulk of what you're doing, and I think this is where some of the best sommeliers and best wine directors are set apart, is how they can manage these things. So inventory organization, the wine list, obviously, staff education, and then managing your stemware and equipment. Inventory, there's lots of different systems restaurants will use to keep track of wine or beverages in general. Bin numbers are quite common with large restaurants and usually fine dining restaurants where you do move a lot of wine and store a lot of wine. And the bin number, it's almost, think of it as like a Dewey Decimal System, maybe. It's a way to easily find something. I get, if anyone's younger than 30, I guess they don't know what Dewey Decimal System is, but look it up. I don't know if there's anyone younger than 30. But it's a way to quickly find wines. It's also a way to be super clear when you're ordering a wine. If there's a bin number, you won't run into the getting confused with a wine that might sound similar, especially if it's in a foreign language. We'll talk about that in a second. But that's a good way to organize wine. Do you have a separate cellar storage? In a lot of restaurants, the physical space of your restaurant, you might not have enough space to actually keep all that wine. So are you purchasing a warehouse? Do you have a storage unit in a warehouse nearby that you can access? Do you have, is there another building? Do you just have a literal cellar or a basement underneath the property? And then just keeping an eye on rotation of high velocity SKUs. So any wine that, like your glass pours, your least expensive wines by the bottle that might move a lot more, do you have enough of that? And are they in really convenient places to manage your inventory? Temperature control is really tricky for restaurants. Ideally all wine is stored between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's for long-term storage is where you want it. A lot of red wines, like bigger red wines, you want to serve at a warmer temperature, which is why you would do something like decant and make it a little warmer. And obviously sparkling whites, rosés, orange wines, some of those weird orange wines and dessert wines that need to be chilled need ample storage space as well. So you're talking about refrigeration, and you could even have Cobs or Euro Cobs, which is a company that makes large sort of refrigerator size wine storage as well. So there's lots of different ways to make sure that your wine is kept at a good temperature to make sure it lasts a longer time. And then also when you bring a new product that might be different than what's on the wine list, having some way to delineate that and label it and make sure that your inventory stays clear, that it's current, and it's being represented by the wine list. So wine lists, I love wine lists. They're also really tricky to put together, but also really fun. And you'll see a whole wide variety of wine lists out there, and some people might enjoy certain types more than others. But the main points of the wine list is making sure it's readable, that it's a nice layout and format. Readable being literally you have the right ink and fonts so that people can read it under low light if your restaurant is sort of a low lit restaurant. And then how is it arranged as far as groupings and categories? Are you arranging it by region or geography or by grape variety or blend? That's great. I've definitely seen some wine lists that try to organize by soil type just because they're trying to be trendy, and it's a really tough thing to do, and it doesn't make a lot of sense, and a lot of times they're just wrong about the soil types anyway. But I can understand wanting to be different and wanting to do some things like that, or even the texture of the wine. Like these are your silky reds, these are your crunchy reds, these are your acidic whites. So making decisions based on how you want the layout to be, and then making sure just your editors in the building will help you with making sure all the spellings are correct, that the vintages are accurate, your pricing is clearly laid out and accurate. And then any other special information like vineyard specification or bottlings are all clearly printed. And then making sure that you do print that wine list enough so that it really is up to date. And if it's not, say you have a wine list that's 200 pages because you're a grand award winning restaurant that has a huge cellar and 1,000 different bottles, and so you have this book, it's going to be really hard to keep that printed all the time, and yet you're going to have wines that run out. Part of having those huge lists is you might only have 1 or 2 bottles of a bunch of things on the list, because they're great bottles, maybe they're hard to come by, and they might stay on the list for a long time because no one really notices them. But as soon as they're gone, that means it's an 86th item. The 86 list is a crucial part of running a wine program. It's something that should be looked at every day. It should be distributed to all of your service staff, if som team, wine team, because I think all of you, or maybe not all of you, but if you've had the experience where you've gone into a restaurant, you look at the wine list, you see a wine you really want to have, and you're like, great, we'd love to have this wine. And then the server goes, and it takes them a few minutes. They go back to see if it's there, and they're like, oh, it's not behind the bar. And so they go check the back stock, and they go to the cellar, and they try to find it there, and oh, no, it's not there either. And then it'll have been 6-7 minutes, which in the restaurant world is an eternity. If you're sitting there waiting for a drink, 7 minutes is a long time. And by that time, they come back to the table, and they're like, oh, I'm so sorry, we're out. And the whole time that wine was on an 86 list, and they may have should have known that it was out of the building. So that's all something that helps. Service flow, it helps with your hospitality, is to know what wines you're out of, and maybe whether they're actually coming back soon, maybe that you're waiting on a delivery of them, or if they're out and gone for good. And then the POS machine, or point of sale, is super important. This is any of your touch screen units on the floor that you use to order food and order drinks to the bar or to the kitchen, making sure that all the names and everything, spelling is correct, the pricing is correct, making sure that your printers are routed to the right place, so that if you need to pick up a bottle of champagne, that it prints out at the bar printer instead of the kitchen printer. Sometimes those mistakes can happen in restaurants. And basically that comes down to who's retrieving the bottle, making sure that they're aware of grabbing the bottle for you. And then making sure too that when the receipt prints from these machines, that it has an accurate and clear name of the wine on your check. Because as a guest, sometimes it can be confusing if you just see a bin number, or you see sort of this code that maybe someone understands, but you're not really sure, was that the wine I chose? Was that what I paid for? So helping to prevent any confusion like that is great. And then staff education. A wine program is really only as good as your staff's ability to relay information accurately and serve wine gracefully. It's what keeps people coming back. It's what makes people think of your restaurant highly. Weekly, bi-weekly, I've seen monthly wine classes as well, is a great way to just get your staff on board, and your entire staff. It's not just something for somms or for wine servers or bartenders. I think support staff, bussers, expos. I mean, a lot of people in the restaurant, in the kitchen, should know about wine too. It really can affect how they do their jobs as well. There's obviously, you can take quizzes online. I've worked in restaurants where you get pop quizzes before shift sometime, because to make sure that you know your stuff. And then often, especially with some of the fine dining restaurants, they'll actually have a dedicated som team or a wine team that will both be working floor shifts and helping to sell wine on any night, but also can assist in mentoring and doing education one-on-one with other employees. I also think for restaurants, a sampling policy that can allow staff to try multiple wines from the bottle list is great. It's crucial to get more people excited about the wines. And at the end of the day, the more knowledgeable your staff is, the more wine you're going to sell, the better for the program. And then there's a whole list of things to keep an eye on and manage as far as stemware. So, which type of glasses are you purchasing? Are you purchasing white wine glasses, red wine glasses? Are you going to do champagne flutes or coupes? Or are you going to do smaller glasses that you can offer flights or half glasses, or different smaller pours in, or dessert wines? So deciding what sort of glassware you'd like, making sure you have enough of it and it's stocked enough to account for breakage, and also have a system in place to make sure you always have clean glass. So this is another thing, and maybe it's just my pet peeve when I'm in a restaurant, is especially if you're in later in the evening and they've already had their first turn and they're trying to get the whole restaurant reset, but you order wine and it comes and the glasses are still kind of hot, and hopefully they're not wet. Hopefully they're either polished or they're dry enough, but they're still maybe a little hot from the glass washer. um, it's not great to put wine into a hot glass. And so it's nice to be able to have either enough glassware on the floor so that that doesn't happen, or you have some system in place where you can make sure that you always have a cool glass. And part of that too, the glass washing machine is so crucial for wine bars and for restaurants. And one of the reasons why those glasses can get really hot is a lot of glass washers actually rely on a lower level of chemicals to clean and instead use really, really hot water. It's a way to clean the glasses, but without any sort of residual chemical sort of aroma or taste in the glass. And it's definitely preferred by a lot of wine bars to have machines like that. But again, then you have to sort of built in the extra time it takes for those glasses to cool. Other equipment, decanters, you have wine openers, decanting baskets, ice buckets to keep champagne cold, trays, there's all sorts of things. And then barware, cocktail shakers, strainers, stirring spoons that have to be ordered, well stocked, cleaned. And then even linens, any sort of napkin or serviette you would use for wine service. And then Garridin is sort of a fancy tableside decanting unit, basically sort of a roller cart that you would use in some fine dining establishments. But if you are fine dining, making sure you have those, that there's a place to store them or push them off to the side. So just a lot of balls in the air to handle. And then you get to sell wine. So put it all together, start making money. So in this, I'm not going to get too much into this, partially because I was never a wine director. My wine experience in restaurants was more the sommelier, bartender, manager position, but I was never actually the one doing the spreadsheets and adjusting profit margins. But I do know some of the theory behind it, basically that a lot of times you can adjust as you go and price things according to what's moving and what you want to move more. So if you have some bottles on the bottle list that aren't moving, but you think they're really great wines, and you want to find a way to lower those prices that might hit a point where people are bound to order them more, you can look at your glass pour margins and find some of the wines that are going really well, and maybe you can increase that a dollar or 50 cents even, and that's enough to lower your price on a bottle about $10 on the list. So there's different ways to look at managing and sort of balancing your wine program that way. Corkage policy, I think, is really important. And so basically, if you're not familiar with the corkage policy, it's a restaurant's policy where if you bring in your own wine as a guest, you are allowed to, most places will have a corkage policy where they'll open it for you, the staff will take it, they'll open it, they'll even decant it for you and serve it for you, but there'll usually be a small fee, anywhere from $10 to $30. I've seen, there's some fancy restaurants that'll charge $100 or $150, but that's when you're talking about, you know, the average bottle price being in the hundreds of dollars on their list. And most of these policies are also only for wines that aren't on the current list. I know I worked at a restaurant where if you brought in a wine that the same wine was on the restaurant list, they would just charge you the full price, the full restaurant price for that wine. So it's a way to sort of protect the list. But at the end of the day, you know, you want to allow guests to drink the wine they want to drink to have a good time, and that relationship, they'll build trust and keep them coming back. So, because at the end of the day, they're still buying food, they're telling their friends how great of a time they're having, and so it helps overall. And like I said, lots of spreadsheets to help sort of understand all of the numbers will make you a successful wine seller. So then just a couple other things, hints and tips for ordering wine. And these were just from a couple conversations I've had recently that I thought, oh, that's interesting, we should talk about that. And then we might get into more sort of in our discussion. So when you're ordering wines by the glass, at least for me, I think it's really important to know how are those bottles stored. So when a bottle is opened and they pour a glass, say they sell 2 glasses of that bottle in a night, and then they're closing and they want to save the rest of that wine for the next day. There's lots of different ways that you can save the wine. You can use a vacuum stopper, sort of a vacuum pump stopper, which tries to get as much oxygen out of the bottle as possible. You can gas a bottle with argon. There's little argon cans to make sure that they'll last a little bit longer. There's Coravens, which a lot of restaurants will do Coraven glass pour lists where they do high-end bottles and they just pour, you get maybe a 4-ounce pour from a Coraven, which is a little machine that sticks a needle through the cork and sucks the wine out and replaces it with argon so that it never sees oxygen. And then there's different wine draft systems out there too, which are actually starting to be really nice. And I've seen some restaurants do that. That'll keep wine a little bit longer open. But a lot of restaurants, I think a majority of them, just recork the bottles. And that's where you could get into some trouble because wine tends to oxidize fairly quickly after the bottle's been open. And so if you order a wine and the wine's been open for 2 days, it won't taste the way it's supposed to. It'll taste a little oxidized and not great. My personal recommendation is if I go into a restaurant and I have the feeling, maybe I see the bottles behind the bar and they're all just normal corks and at different levels, and you can kind of think, wow, they're not, using vacuum pumps. I know that a lot of those bottles look mostly empty. I'll just order a white wine because in general, white wines are stored in the fridge. So even if they are open, because they're in the fridge, there's a little less oxygen. They can last a little bit longer. And so there's less of a chance that you'll run into an oxidized wine. And then by the glass specials, I love when I see a restaurant do special glass pours. There's a lot of different reasons you might have one. Sometimes it's a special promotion from a distributor or a producer. Sometimes it's deliberately put there to pair with a special entree or a dish that night, and so there's a lot of thought put behind it. But a lot of times it ends up being maybe a bottle that another table earlier in the evening ordered, and they tasted it and they just didn't like it. And maybe they ordered a Bordeaux and didn't realize it was going to be as dirty or as funky as it was, and so they switched to something else. Well, as soon as that bottle's open, the restaurant definitely wants to sell it. It's as soon as that oxygen starts affecting it, it's going to start going downhill. So the sooner you can get more people to try it, the better. And so a lot of times that'll turn into a special glass pour. Sometimes it's a hand sell, so meaning it's not printed on a list, but maybe your server says, "Oh, we have a few glasses of this really cool wine left," and it's a great opportunity to try something that you might normally not get a chance to try. And then hints for buying a bottle. This is something both you're as a som you're sort of trained to deal in a really graceful way, but also it's something that if you just upfront say what price you're interested in purchasing or ordering a wine at, it just gets rid of so much awkwardness. It's so nice for everyone involved just to know upfront, you know what, we're looking for a bottle of red wine and somewhere in like the $40 to $50 range, and right away the som has a bunch of ideas. They know not to push anything. They can also undersell you, which on paper might look like it's bad for the restaurant, but a lot of times that's another way to build trust and build value with that guest. So I want a wine 40 to 50, and you're like, you know what, I have the perfect wine for you, but it's only $38, but I think you're really gonna love it. And then they love it, they trust you, they come back and order more wine from you. So indicating a price range you're comfortable with. If you're not the type of person that's like, oh, I want to spend $50, or say you're in a situation, you're on a date and you want to pay for the meal, or you're at a business meeting and you're the boss or the host, and you don't want anyone to worry about price, you're going to be ordering wine. There's ways of taking the wine list, and you could even point and say, we're looking for a wine like this, and point to the price on the list. As a server, as a som, I loved when people did that because it was sort of this nonverbal communication of like, great, this is your range, this is what I can bring you, and we'll go from there. And as a som, you're sort of trained, if you kind of get the feeling they don't want to talk about price, it's basically a similar style where you can recommend 3 different wines on the list at 3 different price points, and literally just circle the wine and sort of move your finger over to the price. And you're like, oh, we could do something like this, or this wine is really great too. And it's just a subtle little way to just get out in front of things, to be like, all right, how much money do you want to spend? Because I don't want to challenge you or pressure you into purchasing something that'll be a little more than you want. And then as far as describing what type of wine you want to drink, obviously there's the whole conversation about, oh, we're going to have this to eat. So what kind of wine would you recommend with that? And the food and wine pairing thing is a much bigger discussion. Like I said, next week we're doing some of that. But in general, if you're not really sure how to describe the kind of wine you like, whether like the texture or the taste, or you're not really sure what sort of region you like. You like a cab, but you might not even know what you like about a cab. You just know you've had a Cabernet Sauvignon once and you really loved it, and you want to get something similar. The best thing you can do is basically just say something you've enjoyed recently. So if you know a bottle, if you know an actual producer or even a vintage that is great, and say, you know, I had this Avennia Gravura 2017 the other day. I loved it. It was so great. Um, that does two things. It tells the som both what style of wine you're looking for, but also kind of what price range, and sort of what you might be comfortable in ordering, and so they can get creative in what they're recommending. I will say as a warning, this is not the best time to brag about that really cool, expensive baller wine you had at a party, and it was just so great, and that that's the kind of wine you like, because then you're sort of opening the door to being sold some really expensive wines. I worked some shifts where someone would tell me, I'd ask, oh well, what sort of wines do you usually like, or do you enjoy? And they're like, oh, I love Screaming Eagle and Harlan, and all of a sudden they name all these super expensive Napa cabs, and um, and part of it is fun. There is something that's fun about sharing these experiences as wine drinkers, to say like, oh, I had a chance to try this wine, it was great. But if you're going to do that, make sure you're also saying, but that was a celebration. Tonight we're thinking something a little different, because with really ambitious sales people on the floor, if you mention Screaming Eagle, they're gonna grab the most expensive wines on their list and try to sell them to you. So, just a little advice for sharing your wine stories. And then lastly, this is sort of the last part of the presentation. Obviously, this year has been really tough for restaurants. So COVID has been just detrimental to the business. I think I read somewhere that 4 out of 10 restaurants across the nation have closed because of COVID. I think there's still probably more that'll happen too. It'll take a while for things to get better for them. A lot of restaurants have been turning to selling their inventory at retail prices. And it's going to be interesting. I kind of want to keep an eye on it, because it might impact the public perception on pricing. And wine bottles, there's a reason that bottles are priced or marked up higher in restaurants than you'd find them in a retail store or at a winery. A lot of that is due to obviously the expenses of running a restaurant, of mortgage payments and payroll, and the fact that you're being served and your dishes are being cleaned. It's all part of that service, and there is some cost associated with that. But it'll be interesting, because you're going to start seeing a lot of wines that you used to like when they were $50, and all of a sudden you're getting them for $20 or $25 to go. And understanding that's good for the restaurant now, but I don't even know. I mean, I'm saying this basically, I don't know what the what the outcome is going to be for this, but it'll be interesting to see how perception of pricing changes. Another big thing this year has been selling cocktails to go. I know it's not legal in every state, but there's been a lot of states that have made it legal. Washington's one of them, Texas, I think, New Hampshire, I think Vermont might have made it legal as well for a while. And that's huge, because you can get a lot bigger margin on liquor, on spirits and cocktails. So it's a great way to keep bars open. It'll be interesting to see too, restaurants that used to have large cellars and huge wine lists, like I was saying before, that they always were going after the Grand Award, which is something by Wine Spectator that they award to top restaurants around the world. A lot of those restaurants are starting to scale back and change the way they're doing their wine programs. There's a lot less interest in holding on to that much inventory, because a lot of this is, you need to have a certain amount of top-notch Burgundy producers and a certain amount of single vineyard, champagnes, and a lot of really expensive wines that it's great to have on a list, because they almost turn into these libraries, these museum pieces of, look at it, I've curated all these amazing artifacts of the wine world. But that's really expensive to hold on to. And when all of a sudden restaurants are in trouble, it's not a great thing to just be sitting on that much cash. So a lot of restaurants are scaling down a bit and focusing on smaller wine lists. And then I would say the last thing is more of a plea, is just find ways to support local restaurants. One of the reasons I chose this topic for this week is actually we're starting a new flash sale at Avennia. So we're actually going to be selling Frank the Tank, which for those local people, this is a wine that we make exclusively for Ethan Stoll Restaurant Group. So ESR has a bunch of restaurants in the area, and they're expanding as well. They're opening stuff up in Spokane and all over. So, but we make a Bordeaux style blend for them called Frank the Tank. And this is sort of the one time a year that we're able to sell it. But in part of that is also we want to support them. And so I encourage all of you, if you can, support one of the ESR locations, Tavolata, How to Cook a Wolf. There's some just amazing restaurants there. to do that. Obviously, ordering to-go meals and beverages, buying gift cards. And then the last thing, too, there is sort of a Restaurants Act that's working its way through Congress, hopefully. But it's a $120 billion proposal for a grant system through the Treasury Department that would be huge for restaurants and would really, really, really help a lot of these small businesses, because most restaurants are small businesses in the country. So yeah, that's basically the presentation, the end. So now we get to maybe just chat a little bit, questions and comments or concerns. So at this point, if you'd like, I have the chat box open. So if you want to ask a question through the chat box, you can do that. You can just say, I have a question, and then I'll call on you and you can unmute to ask it with your voice. And we'll go there. Does anyone sort of have a question off the bat about wine and restaurants? Or any stories too. If you're like, oh man, I remember trying to order a bottle and they got it wrong and it was so hard and terrible. I'll start with a story. So I was talking to my brother-in-law the other day, and they were saying that they went to a restaurant recently and ordered a bottle of wine. They forgot what it was. It was some French bottle, and they ordered the wine. They were like, "Oh, it's a beautiful bottle." They brought it. They poured it, drank it. It was delicious. They went to pay, and they realized they looked at the bill, and the bottle was about $100 more than they thought it was, than the bottle they ordered on the menu. And it turned into this awkward situation, and they ended up looking, and this is one of those situations where there's a bottle by a producer, and say it's like a 2013, I'll use an English example, there's a 2013 Pinot Noir from Oregon from La Crema, and it's it's $30, and then, or $50, and then you might not see it, might not even be on that same page, because maybe it's on another page for like fancy wines, but you might have a 2013 Pinot Noir from Oregon from La Crema that's a single vineyard special bottle that's $100 more. And so if you're not clear with and maybe you are clear when you're ordering, but if there's some sort of lapse in communication, it's such an awkward and hard thing to get to when at the end of your meal you've had a good time and all of a sudden your bill is $100 more than you thought it would be. So it's just one of the hard things about ordering wine in restaurants, and that's again when it goes down to pointing and like using bin numbers if they're there. But hopefully the som or servers or managers are really understanding about those situations. So here's a question from Karen and James. So should we expect the restaurant to have a decanter? That's a great question. I think it depends on the size of restaurant and sort of if they're known for their wine program and how they serve wine. Most restaurants, I can't even say most restaurants, at least in the Seattle area, like in metro areas, a lot of restaurants do have decanters. If they don't, I think so. In decanting, for those unfamiliar with decanting, it's basically a process of moving wine from the bottle, emptying wine from the bottle into a pitcher or decanter or a vessel. And it does a couple things. It can separate the sediment. So if it's an older wine, there'll be some sediment in the bottle, and it's a way to separate that from the wine. It can also warm up the wine. It can increase the temperature a few degrees if it's a little too cold, if it was kept in a cellar. And it aerates the wine, so it adds more oxygen for some of those bigger, maybe tighter, tannic red wines, to soften them up a bit to have. So I don't know if you can expect a restaurant to have one. I also don't know how realistic it is to bring one in on your own. So it's because they probably wouldn't accept it just because as far as cleanliness, health codes, I don't know if that's something they'd want to do. You might be able to get away with it, but but I would assume if a restaurant has a pretty substantial wine list that they'll have a decanter. A couple other questions. Donna asks, what if I take a wine to a restaurant that is an older vintage of a wine they have on their list? How is that typically viewed? At least with the restaurant I was at, that's totally fine. That the wine, if to avoid the corkage, or to avoid paying full price for a wine that's on our list, it had to be the exact same vintage, bottling, and everything. So say we have a 2017 Justine from Avennia on the list, but you want to bring in your 2012 Justine because it had more Mourvèdre in it and it's delicious, then you would just get a normal corkage fee. That would be considered a bottle that's not on the list. But again, that depends on which restaurant you're in. Casey asks, what is your opinion on tipping, including bottle price, i.e., a percentage tip where the bottle is more expensive than the meal? Oh boy, this is what a question. I think this is tricky. Like tipping policy, I think in general is interesting because I think a lot of it depends on where you are. I know that there's lots of reasons to tip well, and there's also it's understandable I think to not feel like you need to tip 20-25% in certain situations, or depending on where you are. Obviously if you're in Canada or UK and other places where it might not be as customary to tip higher, um, you can adjust things there. But with bottle prices it's tricky. I've come across people who don't feel it's necessary to tip on wine because it takes the same amount of effort to open it, maybe, which is not necessarily true, especially with rare, older wines that you might need to candle decant to separate sediment or handle differently. In general, at least my personal opinion is that I always tip on the full bill, so regardless of where the wine is or how much the wine was. But I'm sure, and I'm happy to hear another side of the story if you wanted to share. Um, what is your opinion? That's what I just read. Pete has a comment. Ordering a glass of white wine in a bar or restaurant seems to always be too cold. Pete, I totally agree with you. And I think a lot of times it's true. Those fridges, especially behind the bar, below the bar, are just set so cold because most of them are set at 40, 41 degrees, and that's just usually like a health code thing for food. I think it needs to be at 41 degrees. But for wine, a lot of whites, particularly some of the bigger whites, Chardonnay, Viognier, Rhone whites, and some of those bigger styles, you want to be a little warmer because that's where all the aromatics pop, and that's how you can really enjoy the wine more. When a white wine is too cold, you'll miss all of the aromatics. Like it'll just taste like acid and sugar. So I totally agree, and I think the best thing to do there, if you do get a wine that's too cold, you don't need to send it back. Like obviously, I usually just hold it in my arm, so I take the bowl and just warm it up with my hands, or you give it a little air and just sort of swirl it for a while, and that will slowly raise the temperature. But it's a good point. When we order bottles of white in restaurants, a lot of times we'll have them decant the white bottle also, and it's basically to raise the temperature, to open up those aromatics. Now, I'm not judging anyone who likes putting ice cubes in wine. There's a place for that. I definitely do it on the side of a pool in the summer. If there's a box of Pinot Grigio and I have some ice, I'm a happy guy. So I'm not that kind of som, but in general, I agree. White wine shouldn't be too cold. Oh, good question. So, Karen, this is sort of a follow-up on the decanting question. Is it legal or illegal to decant at home, put back in the bottle, recork it, and then bring it to a restaurant to open? This is a good. I'm gonna follow up with this one because I do think it's illegal. I think when you bring in a bottle, it can't previously have been open. Um, but that also might be a state-by-state thing, law as well. But I know that at least the restaurants I worked at, if a wine has already been opened previously, we can't open it in the restaurant. So, yeah, but those are good questions. Great questions. Well, I think we're at a good place. Did anyone else have a question? Last chance you can wave at me or type everything. These are awesome questions. Do you have a question or are you just waving?
Okay.
Oh, you have a question?
Eli,
Yeah.
Eli, no, I just wanted to say that many states have an open bottle law. You can't have an open bottle in your vehicle.
Yeah. Oh, and that's probably a good point. That might be why you can't do that. So it's funny though, because and in follow up to that, there are different rules though based on how you can send unfinished bottles home with a guest. So say you buy a bottle of wine at a restaurant. There's certain states. When I worked in New York at a restaurant, it was very specific. You had to, if someone wanted to take the rest of a bottle home, it had to be recorked. It had to be put in a bag, and the bag had to be stapled or closed. And then they could take it away in their car or walk away with it. Whereas in some states, I don't think that is allowed. And there might even be, I have no idea what the laws are as far as whether it can be in your trunk or or inside your car if you're driving home. Um, but whereas here in Washington, we don't have to do the whole bag staple a bag thing. We just can put a cork on it and send it with them. So yeah, Patty.
So what do you do with the tasting room there? If you're doing that and you have purchased a bottle of wine, but you haven't finished it. So do you have a bag that you actually do it in?
In New York, or you mean
No,
here?
here
Here.
at your tasting room.
So at least for our tasting room, because the way we're set up and because of our liquor license, we actually we don't do bottle or glass pours at the tasting room.
That's right. That's right. Okay, I remember that now. Thank you.
But with the tasting rooms that do, I assume it's basically the same rules as a restaurant, so that you don't need to put it in a bag or anything. That it can just be corked.
That's right.
Yeah, good question. Cool. Well, this is we're at 50 minutes here. My goal with these discussions is not to keep them longer than about an hour. So I think that's for all of us that spend a lot of time on Zoom. That I think that's appropriate. So I just want to thank everybody. And oh wait, I'm gonna ask to unmute you, Papa. You have to. Oh wait, hold on. You got to push a mute button first. You have a window that says unmute. Let's see. Did one pop up there? There you go. Yep.
Okay. All right. Many years ago, Robin and three of her siblings, we were winding up a 3-week trip in Britain. We had a little money left over, so we stayed at a nice hotel at Heathrow Airport.
Mm-hmm.
Went down to dinner at 6 o'clock. Nobody else was there. Nobody eats at 6 o'clock. And so I asked for the wine list. And the sommelier or whoever came out with this red velvet wine list with a golden tasseled thing down the middle of it.
Yeah.
I opened it up, and every page in that booklet was empty, not one word of print. So I said, well, I really don't see anything I like. And the guy his face fell and he was just crushed. And then I showed him the thing and he was more crushed than ever. It was beyond imagination.
Was it just a mistake? They forgot to
wine list with nothing in it.
You know,
don't let that happen to you, Eli.
That's happened to me once as a server where I bought a wine list and the pages were missing, or there was multiple pages missing in the wine list. Oof.
Yeah, nothing. There was nothing in it.
That's funny. Oh.
Remember that, Robin? Remember
that? Oh, that's a great story. Oh, thanks, Papa. Well, thank you all so much. So again, a little bit about next week. So next week we're going to be doing wine and cheese pairing. And I hope if you are available to join us next week, you'll join in and actually maybe buy a couple of cheeses, a couple different kinds of cheeses, have a couple different wines on hand that you want to open and maybe taste with. We'll get into some of the weird sciencey stuff about food and wine and actually what happens in your mouth as you enjoy both. And then just some of the sort of general theories about food and wine pairing. But this will be the first one, and we'll do some other food and wine stuff down the road as well. So I hope to see a lot of you then. If you wanted to unmute this last minute just to say goodbye, I sort of like hearing people say goodbye before we sign off, then you're welcome to do that. But thanks again. I'll see you in a week if you'd like, and I hope you all well.
Can you tell us about the special again, please?
The special?
Thank you. That's going on for Frank?
Frank the Tank. Yes. So for the next 10 days, for the next 2 weekends, we're going to have Frank the Tank on sale through the winery or through the tasting room. And your wine club, if you are a club member, your club discount applies, so you can get that discount.
I read it didn't.
You only have a certain amount of it available, so definitely you want to get it while you can, as soon as you can.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody.
Bye, Eli.
We'll see you around soon. Cheers.